Hey everyone, this is the Spoon Dude back with another action figure review. This time we'll be taking a look at the Medicom toy MAFEX Spider-Man Classic Costume Version action figure. This is the number 185th figure in the MAFEX line and is pretty much just a repaint of the original number 75 Spider-Man comic version figure, which is this one. You can see this figure is of course the same size as the other MAFEX comic book Spider-Man, because why wouldn't he be? Especially this one, it's the same as this figure. And then in comparison to Marvel Legends, which I find is the comparison most people are interested in, this figure does run about the same height as the new Marvel Legends Amazing Fantasy Spider-Man, while coming up a bit short next to a figure of the Renew Your Vows Spider-Man, which would also be around the same height of the Retro Spider-Man. And then real quick, here's a Pizza Spider-Man with a similar color scheme. So that means he'll more or less fit with your Marvel Legends collection. I think he looks pretty good next to a lot of the villain figures, like iconic Spider-Man villain Dr. Doom. Of course, being the same figure as the number 75, he'll have the same accessories with one or two notable exceptions, which we'll get to. But he comes with all the same hands as the original figure. You get your wall crawling hands, your relaxed hands, your web shooting hands, web holding hands. You get the magnetic version of the wall crawling hands. See the magnets there. And then the magnetic version of his feet. You also get the alternate head, which is a different version of his mask with different set of eyes. Here it is in comparison. There you can see it's just a different artist's interpretation of Spider-Man. Something I'm always into. So if you have the original figure, you notice what's missing here is the unmasked head that the original figure came with. Of course, the original figure was able to come with the unmasked head, as well as a loose version of his mask for him to hold. This one does not get that. So I guess MAFEX maybe managed to retain some of the value of the original release in its reissue by just leaving this accessory with this one. So if you have this version but really want an unmasked head, you still have some incentive to grab this version, I suppose. We also get some web accessories, the same as the original figure, so two longer versions of the web shooting effect, two shorter versions, one strand for him to hold and another strand for him to hold with this sort of end to it. It can be pegged in with this adapter piece thing, and then that goes into your MAFEX display stand. Mine is still in the plastic baggie, but I do like these stands. They're good for what they are. Here's one from a different figure, but it's basically the same thing. So if you haven't seen one of these before, you got this posable arm with the joints that have screws on them, so you can feel free to loosen and tighten them to your pleasure. And then you have the clip at the end, which allows the figure to be held up in the air. So having a closer look at this figure's aesthetics, I do really like it. Again, of course, I like the original figure, and I will bring him out in a second, but just to look at it on its own, especially if you aren't super familiar with the original release, this is the figure. I really like the build of this figure. He's got a nice kind of muscular, but not overly muscular kind of build. He's the right kind of lean frame that I think Spider-Man should be. One of my small issues with the proportions is that I do find the head to be a tad big. I feel like the body is clear that it's, more of an adult Spider-Man, but the slight kind of big head makes it seem a little bit more kind of teenager-like in some poses. The head should have been slightly smaller, and it would have been a little bit more proportional, but that's a small gripe, and honestly, it's not a deal breaker for me. And honestly, it's not that weird for a Spider-Man to have a big head, even when he is supposed to be kind of an older version. Another gripe I may have in terms of this figure's sculpting that's just carried over from the original figure is I do find it a little bit odd how defined his leg musculature is, but then it's a little bit softer in the torso. You can see there, his thighs are bulging, and then his abs and all the sort of side muscles here seem fairly soft in comparison, but again, not a deal breaker. And then here's his back muscles. I think those look fine to me. Maybe the lower legs are a little bit long, but I think that's, fine. One of the things I really love about this figure's sculpt is the fact that all the details are, well, sculpted. The entirety of the costume has been sculpted. All the web lines are nicely engraved, and of course the logos are nicely kind of embossed there. So they're actually kind of raised elements that nicely stand out. And I always prefer sculpted details on my Spider-Man figures. Generally, I prefer sculpted details on all my figures, honestly. Talking about the new part of this figure is the paint job, right? So this figure has a much brighter paint job than the original figure, which I showed briefly, but here he is now. So this is, of course, the original 75 version. You can, of course, see that original figure had a much darker color scheme. The red itself isn't darker, but it has a lot heavier paint shading, particularly in the torso area here. That darkens it up in certain places, whereas this is a more consistent, clean, bright red. And then the blue, of course, here is a darker shade to start, and then they came in with a bunch of shading as well to highlight that musculature. And honestly, I still really like this look. I really appreciate that MAFEX gave it all this sort of paint shading, which is missing here. This figure does not get any sort of shading. But I think for the approach they're going for with this figure, I don't really mind that they skipped out on the paint there. They did give this figure a really nice matte finish as opposed to the metallic finish of the blue here and the slight kind of gloss on the red. Well, it's not a gloss, but they didn't really give it a matte anything. The red was kind of just slightly shiny. Whereas here, everything is done in a more matte style finish. And I think that flat coat really does a lot for the figure in lieu of any sort of paint shading. And it, helps to make it more different from the original release. So this can be kind of a nice, simpler, cleaner look rather than the heavily shaded look of this one. I think what I really like is that this color scheme really harkens back to a more old school kind of look for Spider-Man. It feels very late 60s, 70s, early 80s type coloring for Spider-Man. You look up a John Romita Sr. kind of image of Spider-Man or any of the great artists that came immediately after him, and I think this is kind of the color scheme you'll find on that Spider-Man. So yeah, that color scheme, top notch. However, all that being said, as nice as I think that color scheme is, and as much as I appreciate it being applied on a really nice Spider-Man sculpt, I do feel MAFEX kind of missed an opportunity here. As I said, I think the color scheme matches that kind of classic artwork really well, but to me that just means it was such a missed opportunity to not make a new head to go along with this color scheme. Don't get me wrong, this head sculpt is awesome. One of my favorite Spider-Man head sculpts because it's based on one of my favorite Spider-Man artists, Mark Bagley. This is undoubtedly a 90s version of Spider-Man as drawn by Mark Bagley. However, with this color scheme, I can't help but wish MAFEX put in the effort to make at least one new head. Could have just been an alternate head as well, like they could have still included this one. But instead of the same Sal Buscema alternate head, I kind of wish they made an entirely new sculpt with more John Romita Sr. style eyes to really get that proper classic look. And then it would have allowed this figure to not be a straight up repaint of the original. Of course, the head thing isn't particularly a deal breaker for me, as I already figured out how to do a head swap on the MAFEX Spider-Man figure. My favorite that I tend to do is head swapping it with the No Way Home integrated suit Spider-Man head, which to me is pretty much as close as we're going to get to that more old school classic Romita Sr. look that I want. I still think it would have been really nice if MAFEX kind of put in that effort and did it themselves. But anyways, in terms of quality control and durability, this figure does feel really nice out of package. All the joints are nice and tight and fairly smooth, which is kind of a nice refreshing feeling after having this one for so long and having its joints get loose over time. Something I feel I have to bring up with this figure that's not often talked about with official figures is paint rub, which of course is the bane of the action figure customizing community, but again, it's not often talked about with officially released figures, where often figures manage to, hold their paint for most poses unless you're really, really posing them. Unfortunately for this figure, I find I'm already having paint rub after merely like a week of ownership. Now, sure, I have been posing him a lot, but I don't really feel I've been posing him that much more than my original Spider-Man figure, of which has managed to hold up its paint really well for like 3 or 4 years at this point. This one, on the other hand, seems to have already been starting to scratch the paint off much faster than here. Probably the most vivid example I find is on the back right here. It's just been chipped away just from, I guess, using that torso articulation. And again, here's the original figure that I've had for years and always am posing. No issues there. So that is a little bit bothersome. And I'm also finding some paint rub at the back of the knees right there, because the legs are cast in the red plastic, which even without the red peeking through, I feel like you could probably guess, since there is a slight difference in the shade of blue there. It's not as bad as the color differences on, let's say, the Peter B. Parker figure, but if you are looking for it, you can notice the difference between the painted blue and the cast blue there. Another bit of paint rub as well here at the waist. This happens from bending it that far, so that kind of sucks. And then I'm also getting some at the shoulder. I feel like I'm not getting nearly as bad paint rub on this older figure. I mean, you can see it, but it somehow seems to be worse on the newer figure, which again I've had for way less time than this one. So that kind of sucks. I was thinking if I need to spray some sealer on this or something, if that would help, but probably not. So yeah, it kind of sucks that the paint does scratch. That's probably not really going to stop me from still posing this figure. And honestly, the paint rub really sucks because the figure's articulation is awesome. This isn't really a figure you want to just kind of leave standing, in a vanilla pose and leave it alone. This is a figure you want to be able to pose a lot. And here's why. So the figure has a double ball peg at the top of the neck, a single at the bottom. You get crazy range of motion all around. This guy can look up, no problem, down, and really expressive motion, just all sorts of directions. You get a armpit joint. It's a ball joint that plugs at the bottom of the torso that has a socket to another ball joint that has a hinge. So the arm rotates, of course. The hinge allows it to go out, and then the ball joints here allow for really good sort of inward butterfly movement. You get really good inward butterfly movement there. You can also pivot it up and down. It's a really useful joint for more natural poses. I love that you're kind of really able to bring the shoulder really close to his face there, which is really nice in like a swinging pose to kind of make it feel really natural, realistic. You're really bringing that arm up, as opposed to like a Marvel Legend that only has the kind of forward and back out of the usual butterfly joint. You got a bicep swivel, you get a double jointed elbow, you get the ball hinge at the wrist, so you can move that whatever direction. Double ball peg at the torso, nice leaning side to side, forward, back, and then a ball joint at the waist. So I might be getting more paint rub by doing this, but there's that crunch. There's that back. A lot of side to side, which I really like. You get the drop down hips at the leg, so that's a hinge that pivots that leg downward, so that allows that leg to really kick up a lot. Back, and you get pretty decent splits out of this guy. And of course, with that drop down, it's easy to also bring that leg up and around, so if you really need him to do the splits, no problem. And of course, he has a thigh swivel there. You get double jointed knees. which work pretty well. He's not kicking his own butt, but that's just so that they can get the leg to look fairly natural while bending. You get slight gap when you extend it all the way, but otherwise it's a pretty nice knee. You get the ball hinge at the ankle that rotates at the top, hinge in the middle, and then the pivot at the end, so you can get a good ankle rocker out of him. And then the toe pivot works nicely. So yeah, the articulation works really nicely. I wish the paint held up a little bit better. Again, I'm tempted to kind of give him an additional clear coat just to protect the paint a little bit nicer, but I'm not sure if that would actually help anything. But yeah, minus the paint thing, I do really like the articulation on this figure. He is as fun to pose as the original. Honestly, it's a little bit nicer to pose since the joints are a little bit tighter than the original, so he holds a pose a little bit nicer, and the plastic quality feels a lot more durable this time around. I don't know if that's just the newness of it, but I do feel like it feels sturdier than the original version. And I do know that I feel like MAFEX figures have been getting better with fragility, so I'm hoping none of the joints on this one break or anything like they did on my original. But yeah, articulation, one of the best articulated Spider-Man figures. He's not the most articulated Spider-Man figure out there, but he's up there. So I also should bring up, out of the package, this figure has the shoulders swapped. If you actually look at it when you buy it out of the box, the shoulders are flipped. His right shoulder is on his left, and his left shoulder is on his right. It's easy enough to swap them out using some heat and just popping the shoulders off, popping the biceps off, and then putting everything together correctly. It's easy to swap them back out, but it kind of sucks that you have to do it yourself, but it's not the worst of MAFEX quality control, I guess. So yeah, that's the MAFEX Classic Costume version. I think he's a really nice figure. Of course, I'm a big fan of the original figure, and this being a repaint, it stands to reason that, I'm a big fan of this figure as well. I really love the updated color scheme. I love the classic colors. Of course, I would have preferred a new classic head to go with it, but since I still like this head, and I've already managed to have options for myself for alternate versions for the head, I'm personally not too bothered that this is just a straight repaint with the head and all. I'm sure if you agree with me that this should have come with small eyes, but you don't have, let's say, a Marvel Legends head handy, then that might be kind of a more negative point for you. So is this figure worth your money? Well, the only person who can answer that for you is yourself. Hopefully there's enough information here that you can make a more informed decision. I know I'm happy I bought it, and I know I'm very glad to keep it in my collection. Yeah, that's my review of the figure. Hopefully it was informative or entertaining in some way. And yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the figure in the comments below. Look forward to more videos on my channel. I know I've been really behind on that, but I will try to make more videos this winter. And yeah, so stay tuned for all that. Subscribe, like, thanks for doing all that. Yeah, thanks for watching again. And I like that. Wah!